Hey, everybody, it's Reed. I need you to go to Substack. I need you to go to the home front on Substack and subscribe today. I'm out there. I'm writing every day. I'm doing Substack Lives. I need you to help me join that community to this community. Let's make sure we're getting the good word on America's future out there. Go to Reed Galen at Substack. And now, on with the show.
Welcome back to the home front. I'm your host, Reed Galen. Today, guys, I could not be more excited to be in the great city of Gainesville, Florida, with David Jolly, who is the Democratic candidate for governor here in 2026. David grew up here in Florida. He's the son of a pastor. Today, he and his wife are raising their family in Pinellas County. David served in Congress from 2014 to 2017 and focused on veterans, seniors, supporting law enforcement, protecting the environment, and bringing resources back to Florida. He also worked on cleaning up government corruption, which we can talk a lot about. David became nationally known for his independent streak, leading the Tampa Bay Times to write, quote, "It's refreshing to hear someone take on the system." One Washington Post columnist famously penned, "Jolly speaks the truth." And upon leaving Congress, another columnist wrote, "Farewell to one of those congressmen willing to compromise maybe on issues, David, but not values." He spent the last 8 years as a political analyst for MSNBC. His work has been featured in Time, USA Today, Roll Call, The Washington Post, The New York Times, CNN, NBC, and the Tampa Bay Times. He received a bachelor's degree from Emory University and a JD cum laude from George Mason. David, welcome.
Hey, welcome to Florida. That's a lot. That's too much to read, but it's great to have you here.
No, and it's good to see you again outside a green room.
That's right.
Right? Well, in a very fancy hotel room, but
I told you last night, and I know your listeners know this, I love watching you on TV because you kind of don't give a you-know-what when you get up there, and I love it. I love it.
And as my listeners know, the claim to my success is famously no preparation whatsoever, which, as you can see from this interview already. All right, so let's talk about this. I want to start a little bit on the idea of evolutions. So you and I both came up in the Republican Party. You and I are of a certain age. And, for us, I think, I don't want to speak for you, I want to hear it from you, but for us, I think that Donald Trump was a bridge too far, right? There were always elements within the GOP that were sort of like, are you kidding me? But now the are you kidding me wing is like 80%.
Yeah.
And we have Donald Trump sitting atop that. I don't want to spend a lot of time about Trump,
Sure.
but for the beginning of your evolution, was he the catalyst?
He was the defeat. And it's interesting. I think within kind of call it the Never Trump community, the Republicans with conviction community, there was this fight that I'm not sure we have admitted is over. So I mean that, right? Because there's compassion and convictions on the table with it. Look, I was a Bush 41 Republican. I believed in the basic tenets: less government, less regulation, less taxes. Fought the emergence of the Tea Party, and we won a few cycles, right? 06, 08, 10, we kind of kept them at bay. But ultimately, we lost to the Tea Party. I was in Congress during that period. And so as a Republican in Congress who supported marriage equality, climate science, gun control, campaign finance reform, Republicans didn't want me. Democrats didn't need me. But then we moved from losing to the Tea Party to Donald Trump's ascendance. And it was in Congress. This was kind of prior to the Cheney-Kinzinger Congress. I was the only Republican in Congress to call on Donald Trump to drop out of the race, to never come around to supporting our nominee. And that was kind of the end of my run. I had been redistricted anyway.
Three times in 3 years or something.
Three times in 3 years. It was vicious. But I was kind of on my way out as it was. And so as I left Congress, I also left the party.
Yeah, and I think that's, for me, it was when it was sure he was going to be the nominee, that was it. I said, if this is what the party wants, you can count me out. So let's continue down this evolutionary path, because it's interesting, coincidental that we actually sort of trod a similar path. So after I left the GOP, I joined something called the Serve America movement as the chief strategist. Right. The idea, I think, right before you got there was, we need a third party. This was led by a lot of folks who were in the wake of 2016 said, we can't do this. At least in my time there, we got exactly one ballot line in New York State, which Andrew Cuomo, who now refuses to go away, and the Democratic legislature famously made it that much more difficult to get ballot access in New York.
That's right.
I left there in 2019, prior to the Lincoln Project, but you were there, I believe, as chair for a couple of years.
I was, yeah.
And so, as I think somebody in the Tampa Bay Times said, you've always had that independent streak, that willingness to go against the grain.
Yeah, look, I kind of reject dogma. In fact, what I loved most about my time as an independent, I was in an independent in Florida, an NPA, no party affiliation, for 6 to 7 years. I worked in the independent movement. We took the Serve America movement from 1 state to 4 in terms of recognition, and frankly to 8 or 12 in terms of real organization. Look, multi-party democracies, we know the data around the world provide for better outcomes, better voter participation, better voter satisfaction, better coalitions. The United States is almost an outlier in how we have rigged the system for just two parties. But what I also discovered about the independent space was really informing for my personal politics, as well as how I think we need to lead our national politics. And so a couple things I learned. The independent space is so often confused as being all moderates. They're not. I mean, some are wildly progressive, some are wildly conservative, some are moderates, some are pragmatists. What I
Some are those who just don't want a party label anymore, but go back to
Sure.
their own party when the time comes.
Yeah, they perform as loyal Republicans or Democrats. Some are distrustful or are cynical. What I discovered about my own politics that I think reflects a lot of the independent movement is I'm really a pluralist, right? I kind of reject the left-right spectrum altogether, and this is what the Serve America movement tried to build a coalition around. So what do I mean by that? I want big solutions to big problems, and some of those solutions are on the left. Some might be on the right. Some might be in the middle. But let's reject the kind of the major party left-right spectrum requirements and just say, how do we solve problems for people? That was the independent space. Now, what led me to the Democratic Party? Go back to my journey as a Republican, where I was exercising values that the Republicans didn't want in the ascendance of Donald Trump, values that I exercised as an independent, but values I fundamentally see in today's Democratic Party. And I talk about three values every time I'm on the trail. The economy should work for everyone. That means every wage earner. That means our lowest wage earner, but that also means our business creators, right? We shouldn't condemn success. I believe in a capitalist economy. It should work for everybody. The second value is the government actually has a role in our lives, kind of what Bill Clinton talked about in 1992. Now, it should be efficient, it should be lean, but it should provide services to our seniors, our veterans, our storm victims, families in need of excellence in public education, provide law enforcement for safe communities. The government actually has a role. We shouldn't always attack it. And the third value is just simple. We should be a state and a country where everyone is welcomed and celebrated, regardless of the color of your skin, where you were born, who you love, or who you worship. Those values I had as a Republican, I had as an independent. I see them in today's Democratic Party. It's why I'm a proud Democrat today in the state of Florida, but we've got a lot of work to do within our party on that.
Right. Almost Thomas Paine or Jeffersonian.
It is. Look,
know.
I mean, look, I'm a person of deep faith, but you know who I have great kinship with? The agnostics and the atheists that reflect Jefferson's natural rights of man.
Deists. Most of the founding fathers were actually deists. They believed in a higher power, but they weren't going to church necessarily on Saturday.
Sure.
Sunday.
And even if you reject a deity, the basic civility and dignity of everyone among us, I think there is a great kinship among the faith communities and people who practice no faith at all in this environment. 8 years, 10 years into Donald Trump, where we have been divided around this toxic culture war, marginalization, attacks on our own citizenry, attacks on our own neighbors. I just think there's a coalition there ready for change.
Well, and it does appear that we have been in a change environment for, frankly, a pretty long time. If you think about the idea, and I was talking to some folks the other night about this, David, that if you think about in the 2008 election, if we go back in history a little bit, that the opportunity was in the Democratic primary between Hillary Clinton, who everybody thought was going to win, and this upstart nobody had ever heard of named Barack Obama.
Yeah.
And Obama represented change.
That's it.
Right? 8 years later, switched to the general election, Hillary Clinton again, and Donald Trump again.
Yeah.
Hillary Clinton represented a time of great abundance, great, wealth creation, all these other things. But for her, I think in that position was a status quo candidate.
Sure.
Whereas Donald Trump, people were, again, to your point, looking for change. And I would even make an argument that hope and change and make America great again are two sides of the same coin.
I fully agree with you.
One in the major key of Obama and one in the minor key of Trump. So let's talk about that. Now, here we are in Florida. So it's one thing to evolve from one party to another. It's another thing to come on home and say, I was a Republican in Congress, now I'm a Democrat running for governor. So, I was lucky enough to meet your lovely wife last night and hear about your kids a little bit. you've been a candidate, so you know what's ahead. Why did you decide now and here were the time to re-enter electoral politics?
Because we need change. And in Florida, it's a lived experience for my wife and I, right? Our
Right.
kids are 6 and 4. Now, I don't want to put the whole decision on my kids. In fact, our daughter took a little bit of time to get used to this. Once they discovered the campaign trail is about hotels and pools and lazy rivers, like
Yeah.
they're okay with it.
Yeah,
But
right.
um, but no, look, the lived experience for my wife and I, much like all Floridians, is Florida a place that we want to raise our family?
Right.
Look, I'm a fifth generation Floridian. I was born and raised here. I deeply love the state. And it's heartbreaking to say we wrestle with the question often, should we raise our family in Florida? We're committed to Florida. We're committed to this race, and we're going to win the governorship. And as we do that as a coalition across Florida, we can change the direction of Florida. Um, but where are we seeing that? There's an affordability crisis, much like all other states. In Florida, it's unique around homeowners insurance. We're a natural disaster state where the insurance market has failed. Access to housing is too expensive. We have an abandonment of public education and a private school voucher program that is not serving the families that were promised it would. We have car insurance rates and utility rates that are through the roof. It is a state where they continue to fight communities, not crime, right? Ron DeSantis is attacking our immigrant community. He's not attacking crime. And so we're an inflection point in Florida history where that question arises, do we want change or more of the same? And it's been fascinating to explore that as a Democrat in the Democratic Party because even our own party is wrestling with what does change look like?
Yep.
Is it the super young progressive? Is it, in the case of my governorship race, building a coalition around values with progressives and moderates, maybe even some folks right of center, but saying we don't get to change things if we don't win?
Right.
What Democrats in Florida need to do is win. Right now, our voter registration delta, we lack 1.3 million votes in voter registration. There are not enough Democrats in the state of Florida to win. And so, in some communities like Manhattan, maybe the family conversation is around a Mandami or a Cuomo or an Adams. In Florida, it's about how do we build a coalition bigger than our party that actually allows us to win and then change the direction of the state.
Well, and that's the thing that I've experienced in the last 5, 6 years fighting alongside Democrats. And I say this with all the love in the
That's
world.
right.
There's a claim of a big tent. And I say, your tent might be big enough, but what I've experienced is your door isn't wide enough,
Yeah.
right? You
Yeah.
have to be more accepting of people
Sure.
coming in the tent and understanding that living under this cover does not necessarily mean we all
That's right.
collect around the center
That's
post.
right.
There's going to have to be space within that tent for folks
right.
to, remember, even to use an old Republican, Ronald Reagan said, somebody who agrees with me 80% of the time is not my 20% enemy.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And listen, I want to be careful how I approach this because this is my responsibility, right? I don't want to point the finger at anybody except myself. This is my responsibility to unify the Florida Democratic Party. And what I often talk about is the reason I lead with the values, truly, is I think the three values of an economy that works for everyone, a government that serves its people, and a place where everyone's welcome, we can all agree on, right? I sat with a group of young socialists in St. Petersburg, Florida, talked about my values, right?
Now, can I just say, I told this joke last night, but I think it's worth it. If you and I 10 years ago were having a conversation with the
Right.
words, I was sitting with a group of young socialists.
exactly
And it's just as I said, like, I could never have imagined that 10 years ago I would have been canvassing for Kamala Harris, but here
That's
we are
exactly
talking
right.
about abolitions. Please continue on.
Well, and look, today we're in Alachua County, where around the greater University of Florida community, it is kind of deep blue. There's a lot of liberalism and progressivism, but we're surrounded by deep red counties, right? Deep red counties. I'm going into deep red counties, some of the most red areas of the state, talking about these values. And so, my ask of today's Democratic Party is to accept that we actually really do agree on these values. Young, old, left, middle, right, whatever it is. The reason we have these values is because they get to inform our policies when we win. And what I beg of the party, and I accept responsibility for moving us in this direction, is let's not spend the next year fighting each other. Let's focus on fighting Republicans at the ballot box because we're aligned on values. If we spend the next year picking each other apart on litmus tests or on age or on any other, walk of life, going in either direction or both, we're going to lose a historic opportunity to win the governorship of Florida, because we can win this cycle if we unify as Democrats and we watch Republicans have their circular firing squad in their primary.
Right, and I want to get to that in a minute, but let's talk about the issues that are facing Floridians, because
Yeah.
again, I would say most Americans who aren't here think about Florida in a couple of ways. They think about it in Disney World, they think about it in the terms of hurricanes,
Sure.
and they think about it in whatever they get out of the last Carl Hiaasen novel.
Yeah.
There's always something that happens in Florida that wouldn't happen anywhere else.
Hey.
But that's what makes it so unique, and why it makes it like much like California, Florida has a place in Americans' imagination, right?
That's right.
But let's talk about the things that we have seen in the almost 2 terms of Ron DeSantis. To your point about affordability, right? So
Right.
if you can afford a house, there's a really good chance you can't afford to insure your home.
That's exactly right.
And obviously, again, as you noted, Florida's a natural disaster state. Hurricanes roll in and out of here
That's
all the time. And I think, as someone who used to work at FEMA, I think a lot of folks forget that the hurricane in and of itself is really the beginning of a
That's
process.
exactly right.
Flooding, storm surges, the recovery, the response, and then the recovery. The recovery could go on for months or years.
That's right.
Which takes an enormous amount of resources, typically public resources, government resources. But you
right.
can't just leave somebody sitting on their roof,
That's
right,
exactly
when their
right.
water's gone up. But it seems that, to your point, the role of government now in Florida, at least state government, appears to be almost punitive toward its own citizens. Good luck.
It is. That's exactly right. Look, in our home neighborhood, for my wife and I, we were in the direct path of several of last year's largest storms. We still have neighbors who aren't in their homes, right? The government has a role in providing hotel vouchers and food vouchers and assistance and so forth. Here's what I would say about the last 6 to 7 years of Ron DeSantis. The free state of Florida is a lie. It's a lie. It's a lie both based on our economics, but also on our culture and personal liberties and personal rights. And so Florida has become too expensive for too many families, right? The notion that, take the age of our children, the number of years I will need to work if we choose to live in Florida compared to if we choose to live in another state is a real decision,
Yeah.
right? It's an opportunity cost for what amount of time I have to spend with my children's lives compared to at the workplace earning a living. Now, look, that's just part of the walk of life, right? But when it becomes a real economic decision, what is the opportunity cost of trying to afford to live in Florida compared to somewhere else? And my wife and I are fortunate. We were with a young lady last night, 30 years old, who thinks home ownership is out of reach.
Right.
And so, look, what do we need in the state of Florida? We need a state catastrophic fund that removes hurricane coverage from the private market. We cannot cover in our natural disaster states, California, Florida, Tornado Alley, and others. We can't cover natural disasters anymore, and we're fooling ourselves to think we can. We've ignored climate science too long. It is too expensive for private insurance, so we need a state catastrophic fund in Florida. It would reduce private homeowners insurance by 60 or 70% in many cases.
Wow.
For that 30-year-old last night, we need first-time homebuyer tax relief that says, look, we're going to give you a 3, 4, 5-year step up in basis to get to your full tax rate so that you can at least enter the market. Because 20 years ago in Florida, we rightly gave that privilege to longtime homeowners to allow them to stay in their home. Well, now we have an inverted economic problem for first-time homebuyers. But the affordability crisis goes to our schools.
Mhm.
We gave universal vouchers away, and they started funding private schools, and the private schools started adding tuition on top of the
Well, sure, of
vouchers.
course.
And we abandoned our public schools. So now you're a Florida family trying to figure out how to educate your kids, and you're getting hit with a tuition bill. Your alternative is an underfunded public school. Car insurance could go into a cat fund. Our utilities are a regulated monopoly
Right.
that our lawmakers have allowed to keep at bay clean and renewable energies that would not only provide for stewardship of the environment, but drive down costs for customers.
Because they're cheaper, I assume.
They're cheaper. They're
because
certainly
fossil fuels are cheaper.
Yeah. That's exactly, more profitable is probably the best
Okay,
way to put it.
Right.
For our regulated monopolies, we should consider breaking up our utility monopolies in the state of Florida. That's a big, bold idea. And then also in Florida, look, we're in the land of the swamp, University of Florida, for people who follow college football. But I promise you, there's a bigger swamp right up the road in Tallahassee, Florida.
Yeah, right.
It is the swampiest state capital in the entire country. We need dramatic ethics, campaign finance reform legislation in Tallahassee. I fought for it in D.C. I knew I was taking on an effort that would lose me friends. And what I said then, sadly, is it's going to take a crisis for some of our solutions to become popular. but we've got a crisis in Tallahassee around corruption.
Let me ask you this. So the corruption and the self-dealing and the vouchers and those sorts of things, do you think we're so far down the road of voter or citizen or resident apathy or even antipathy towards government, which is, I don't believe any of you. I don't think any of you are out to help me, right? Like, you say this, my life doesn't get better. You say this, my life gets a little bit worse. Why should I believe any of you? Because in my travels, that's what I've seen, is that people are like, you're coming to me telling me to vote. It doesn't matter.
Yeah. So if you break out the absolute loyal partisans, right, who overlook everything, right, because for loyal partisans, it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
I do think within then that persuadable community, there's a resignation that there's nothing they can do about it because we have so rigged incumbency protections through gerrymandering and primaries. And in Florida, we have unlimited slush funds, corporate and individual donations that can go to our governor and our elected legislators. Unlimited.
And in Tallahassee, correct me if I'm wrong, but the legislature does have term limits, but they've so been engineered that you know who's going to be the House Speaker
6 years out.
6 years out. Right?
And the special interests also then control. Like one of the things term limits do, I don't actually support term limits. I support gerrymandering reform, primary reform, campaign finance reform. What it's getting at is accountability, right? When people want term limits, they want to be able to recall their electeds. Well, let's do that through gerrymandering reform, primaries, and so forth. That's another conversation. But I'll give you an example of raw corruption. Tallahassee continues to overrule local voters in blue communities across the state of Florida. A good example is Key West voters by initiative voted to keep out large cruise ships.
Right.
It was damaging the environment.
This was 5, 6, 7 years ago.
5, 6, 7 years ago. Tallahassee said, no, we're not going to let those voters do that. They overruled an initiative. And then the next week, Ron DeSantis took $1 million from the cruise lines. They did it on plastic bags in St. Petersburg. They did it on open primaries in Sarasota. Right now, they've insisted on painting over our intersection murals that celebrate Pride or other local initiatives.
And there's been a big fight about this outside the nightclub in Orlando, I believe.
Oh, sure. It was one of the memorials to the lives lost at Polk's nightclub.
Right.
And so it's an example. Look, you remember this. The Republican principle, government closest to the people is best.
Local control, right.
Unless it's a blue community, is the current viewpoint.
Now listen, I live in Utah. In a blue community. I understand exactly what you're talking about.
It's awful. And so look, the principle of home rule should be this. Statutorily, as government, I will do what I can to return to home rule. But the spirit of it, so the Florida Department of Transportation has the right to paint over these murals. That doesn't mean they need to.
Right. As my dad used to say when I was a teenager, just because you can do something doesn't mean you should.
Go talk to the DeSantis family today if you would.
I will do that. I'll drive on up to Tallahassee from here. I'm sure they'd be happy to see me.
That's right.
And so let's talk about that. I mean, you talk about, I saw that there was news that the alligator Alcatraz, I even hate to use the name, this chain link fence housing, I don't even want to call it housing, imprisoning nonviolent people is a $200 million cost to the state. That is already, as you said, with all of the other things that we've already discussed, doesn't have the money. But here, throw it at this, because again, I think all of this stuff, and I want to get to vaccines in a second too, whether or not it's Alligator Alley or vaccines, is, to me, is the people of Florida having to suffer for another quixotic Ron DeSantis presidential campaign.
Yes, his presidential campaign. He's trying to be on the tip of the spear for all things MAGA and conservatism. Let's start with some very top line important issues. The undocumented worker in the state of Florida is not a threat to our community, to our public safety. The person who is here simply to try to work a day's labor for a day's wage to put food on the table so their little girl can go to school and learn English and chase the American dream. Sure, we need to provide a pathway to some type of legal status for that person. We need immigration enforcement at the borders. We need tall walls, wide gates. But those individuals that are being rounded up, who have done nothing more to violate the law than being here trying to work hard, it becomes cruel pageantry for Ron DeSantis. And that's where, if this race has a contribution in the national conversation, I think for too long, Republicans under Trump and DeSantis, with the help of Fox News, have successfully conflated immigration and crime. when we know statistically that there's a higher rate of violent crimes and property crimes among native-born communities than there are among immigrant communities. And so they're fighting communities, but not fighting crime. But now I think for Democrats, and what I talk about as a Democratic candidate, we need to be tough on crime. We need to be tough on crime. But that means if you were born here, if you immigrated here from Cuba, Venezuela, New York, Ohio, wherever you came from, or if you're a dirty politician in Tallahassee who steals $10 million from the Medicaid program,
Right.
if you break the law, we need to be the party that says, yeah, we're going to come for you. That's not what's happening at the detention center in the Everglades. The good news about the detention center in the Everglades when it comes to the ability to close it is it was opened because Ron DeSantis used executive authority to open it, to take land from Miami-Dade County. I can undo that executive order on day one and begin to unwind Alligator Alcatraz.
So let's stay on executive authority for a second, because as what you've talked about, and we've seen this at the federal level, and now we're seeing it here, and we've seen it in Florida for several years, is it's really not about an ideology of home rule or closest to where you live. It really is just about power. But you get to Tallahassee, you're sworn in,
Yeah,
you're going to have at least a very hostile legislature.
sure.
So, do you have to utilize that same executive authority to
Yeah.
make changes in the face of a legislature that is just
Sure.
trying to wait you out?
Sure. I love that question because, look, my wife and I had to answer two questions getting in this race. Can we win? And if we win, can we be effective? We can win because we're in the midst of a national change election and affordability crisis in the state of Florida. And we're seeing that in all the special elections moving by 15, 16, 21 points in Orlando. Earlier this week, we saw an election swing towards Democrats. But if Florida's voters elect a Democratic governor, and I understand my language, not if David Jolly wins. If Florida's voters elect a Democratic governor in 26, the Republican legislature will be humbled and humiliated. And they have to then worry about their voters, not the Democratic governor. So some certainly would be hostile, but we get to set the agenda then. You tell voters why you're against the state catastrophic fund for insurance, why you're against a 10-year renaissance in education in the state of Florida. We get to set the agenda. But how do we use executive authority? We use it to return power to people and to communities, not to take power for Tallahassee, which is what Ron DeSantis has done. And so
I would argue really for himself.
for
than
himself.
anything. Yeah.
But what does that look like? It means getting the ideologues and the special interest out of all of our agencies where we suffer from agency capture. I lament having to say this, but the first thing I get to do is fire all of Ron DeSantis' appointees
Right.
to the state university system, to our water district boards, to the Public Service Commission that regulates our utilities. We get to appoint people that believe in data and science and math and vaccines and public health, clean air, clean water. We get to appoint people to our university system that actually elevate academics and understand that, yes, pushing our range of diversity, academic, cultural diversity, enriches students, better prepares them for life and for the world. There is a lot that can happen on day one where we use executive authority then to return power to local communities. We allow local voters and local electeds to make those decisions. But very importantly, we would try to return the individual franchise and suffrage to the voter that has suffered from voter suppression under Ron DeSantis. I do think there's a lot we can do by executive authority.
We have a few minutes left here, so I want to go back to something you referenced a few minutes ago, which was really young Floridians and by extension younger Americans.
Yeah.
You mentioned you met last night with a young woman who says she's not going to be able to buy a house, and I've heard the same thing from many of my friends and colleagues and people I've met on the road. There was a Wall Street Journal survey out recently that 76% of Americans say the American dream is dead if it ever really was a thing. Then you mix that with this latest, you don't have to vaccinate your kids, right? You can send your kids. And what it seems is that all of this is, again, if it's not punitive on purpose, it has the same effect, which is younger Floridians, right, are going to be sicker, less educated, less able to succeed, and less willing to believe that any of this matters. So why do I show up? Why do I participate? So how do you speak to? We're going to go see some of those younger Floridians here at the Gators. How do you speak to them? Because we can be pretty sure that somebody who's over the age of 55, right, as you call them, a super voter, somebody who's died, they're going to show up. But how do you get those people who are just coming online as either voters, citizens, young adults who are now going out into a world that looks nothing like what you and I grew up in? How do you get them to pay attention? How do you get them to say, no, wait, we do have a chance, but I need your help?
So listen, I get this question a lot, and you ended with what my answer is, which is to say to the young person, you're right to feel overlooked. You're right to feel as though there's nothing that works for you in our politics. To change that, I need your help. I need your help, right? I, at 52 years old, given my life experience and fortunately a few decades in politics where I've learned both on policy as well as the basics of building coalitions, I can bring to the table what I can bring to the table. And I'm crossing that bridge as far as I can towards you. But I need you to come towards me and reach out as well, because the disaffected who just throws up their hands is a real trouble for the future of our country and our state. It's certainly for my campaign, right? We need to mobilize and activate and excite all voters. But I need people to participate and to meet me halfway. The reason I talk about those values is to say, let's start by agreeing on that. Let's try to build community and coalition, figure out where the answers are. I do think something we suffer from, and I think this is the long-term impact of the Trump era, call it the DeSantis era as well. I think the attack on legitimate expertise has become the new call of patriotism on the right, and it is tearing apart our ability as a society to continue to grow and to provide for society and for public good, to provide for public health, for public safety, for public education, for an economy that actually works for everybody. And, one of the most prescient insights I had about Donald Trump, a Donald Trump supporter, was a cab driver in DC. It's the bartender, the cab driver.
Sure.
And he said to me, I voted for Donald Trump because I wanted somebody to break everything.
Yeah.
And he said, I never expected he was the one capable of fixing it, but I just wanted somebody to break it and somebody else could fix it. But I'm afraid breaking it has become the call of MAGA and the call of Republican leadership. And so in Florida, where Ron DeSantis right now is proposing that we eliminate vaccine mandates, it might feel like freedom, but it's actually very dangerous. There's a reason that these vaccines have changed modern society and the reason we should keep them, and I would fight to keep them. He's also proposing eliminating all property taxes with no plan for where the revenue comes from. So imagine that. Republicans want to defund police, defund schools, defund transportation, because in his language, if you're having to pay taxes, you never really own your home. Those are dangerous narratives. And this comes down to, look, I know you were with McCain. There were times where leaders have to lead. McCain did that very well. At a time when maybe the politics didn't make sense in his own party or in his own state, he understood that leaders have to step out and be the leading indicator, not the lagging indicator. We need leaders to lead in this moment. It's why I'm running for governor.
Well, and let's just stay on the vaccine thing for a second, because if you look at it, right, I read somewhere, maybe it was on social media, that there was one of these influencers who said, "Why should I get my kid vaccinated against a disease I've never heard of?" And somebody else wrote back, "You never heard of it because of the vaccine."
Because it's been eliminated.
Right,
That's
because
right.
it got eradicated.
Yeah.
And so now you have a situation where you have underfunded schools. You now have kids who are going in there. It's not as if measles is hard to spread.
That's
It is
right.
amongst the most voracious
And it
things.
knows no state lines.
Right. Yeah.
It's only a matter of time before
Viruses
Florida.
do not care about state lines, as we've learned. And so now what happens is you're going to have a situation theoretically, and hopefully it never comes to this, where you have a lot of sick kids who are then overwhelming the public health system, right? Because the parents don't know what else to do, which is an emergency room, which was the place of last resort. It's emergency, right? It's not prime healthcare. And then you're not going to have any way to pay for it.
That's right.
Because you're getting rid of your sources of revenue while people are leaving because it's too expensive. And
exactly right.
If you are one of those people who comes here to work, let's say in the hospitality industry, you're either scared to go to work, or because, let's say, people from Europe or Canada or wherever don't want to come here anymore, now you don't even have a job. So it just becomes this circling of the drain intentionally. They said, no, we want to do these
that's
things.
right. That's right. That's right.
This is how we would like the state to look.
That's right.
And to me, that is, I mean, you're right. Maybe it is the Trump era. Maybe it is the Trump order. I don't know. But like, of all the things that we could do, right? It just seems like we are going are the leaders here, at least here in
Yeah.
Florida and nationally, are going out of their way to say, no, we really not only do we not
Sure.
care about you, we don't like you, and we don't care what happens to you.
Look, let's be honest, there's a real ignorance that has infected a certain part of our politics, and that ignorance has disastrous consequences. One of the reasons that I've changed, right? I didn't just change my party, I've changed my positions on a lot of issues over the
Sure.
last 10 years because when I was serving in Congress, some of the positions I took to Congress, as I was applying those, a lot of kind of conservative theory and dogma to real life moments, I didn't like the results, right? It's what led me to really move a long ways on gun violence prevention. I'm a real gun violence prevention advocate now, where I wasn't before I started applying conservative dogma on reproductive freedom. I was wrongly applying my faith positions in Congress, and as I started to see the impact on how my votes would reduce care in underserved communities, I ended up becoming, over the next 5 years or so, an advocate for Roe and Casey and reproductive freedom. What does all that have to do with this moment? It is because I think, look, freedom is a very powerful drug, and it has been sold by MAGA and Trump and DeSantis, I think, in some really irresponsible ways, right? The whole free state of Florida. Freedom's a powerful drug. But but the role of government and a collective society is to provide for the public safety and the public health. We know, even if you go to constitutional protections, that our fundamental freedoms are not absolute. Speech, press, assembly, the Second Amendment, they're fundamental freedoms, and we need to protect them, but they're not absolute, right? You can't yell fire in a fireplace. You can't cause disruption. You can't assemble in the middle of an intersection. We've even agreed, though the right doesn't like to admit it, on certain regulations on firearms. So fundamental liberties are not absolute. How does that come into this vaccine conversation and what's happening in Florida? It is a powerful narrative for Ron DeSantis and the Surgeon General to say, we just want you to be able to decide, right? You should have all the power. Now, you shouldn't have the power to use your vote to ban cruise ships or, or
Right.
ban plastic bags. But in this case, we want you to have the power. The problem is, this is where government and a collective society has to provide for the public safety. We provide for public safety in a number of ways. Our traffic laws, our gun laws, our school laws,
Right.
we promote the public good, right?
Why
Public,
doesn't Ron DeSantis just say run red lights? Go ahead.
exactly.
Run 'em.
Do what you want. We shouldn't regulate it. That's a great analogy, right? And so we have the vaccine mandates because science supports the idea that
And outcomes, literal outcomes.
literal outcomes, that it is at minimal risk to the individual, that it has dramatic safety impacts and public health outcomes, and it allows us to assemble in classrooms as young kids without putting our children in fear of disease. Now, look, in Florida, we have current exemptions for faith-based exemptions, and one or two others. Let's keep those. That's fine. Or a child with compromised health, if the doctor says we shouldn't give the vaccination, those are good exemptions. We should keep them. But this notion to say no one should have to get one, look, if that's the case, well, then maybe you shouldn't be afforded to go into our education environments, because the whole point of keeping safe communities is providing for the public health in public arenas.
Well, and I'm sorry, I'm going to steal a couple extra minutes from you because this is the other part too, which is if you decide not to vaccinate your child,
Mhm.
right, or yourself, and you get sick, and then you go to a public ER or a private ER because they can't turn you
Yeah.
away, right? Right. Then you're saying, okay, well, I want to do what I want to do, but when the time comes, I'm going to rely on the system.
So I love this because, look, part of the Affordable Care Act and some of the regulations provide for non-discrimination among
Mm.
insurers. So let's move this from the hospital coverage or state-backed coverage to just insurance coverage. Maybe Republicans should accept then a market-based solution to whether or not there are differentiations in insurance costs for a family who chooses not to vaccinate.
Right.
I would think if I'm the insurer and I know you're not vaccinating your kids against measles and all these other diseases, you're now a higher risk category for me. So
Right.
if there's a market-based answer to this, maybe if you're one of those families, maybe your insurance rates go up. I mean, this is something that Ron DeSantis is.
Because isn't that personal responsibility?
It is personal responsibility.
Remember when we
That's
were
exactly
Republicans,
right.
we used to love talking about personal
Yeah.
responsibility for you, but not for me.
Yeah. Look, the answer is elect a different governor, fire our Surgeon General,
Right.
keep the vaccine mandates in place, but keep the vaccine exceptions in place for compromised children and for religious reasons.
Because again, this is part of the mythology that has really been built up over the last, let's call it 80 years since World War II, right? Which is this idea of, the individual and all this other stuff, which is great, right? And
It absolutely,
compared to most other countries in the world, most Americans are freer, right? I will only say this, most Americans of a certain economic attainment are freer than any human that has ever lived.
that's right.
But that does not mean that, like, if the gas pump stopped working, if your AC didn't work,
Oh,
if the
sure.
world, like, the point is, like, no man or woman is an island, right? And that this is to your point, this is the very dangerous fiction that has been sold, which is all well and good right up until you decide, you know what, I can run that red light and somebody T-bones you
And-
at the intersection.
And there's just such a false, there's an ignorance and a falsity to what Ron DeSantis is selling right now. Look, we wake up in the mornings, we turn on the light switch, we're getting a regulated monopoly that's providing us power to our home.
Right.
We get in the car, we get on public roads that are paid for through taxpayer dollars. We go to the local hospital and it's socialized medicine, whether we like to call it that or not. All of the public goods and the environment we live in are all paid for through a collective tax base that then provides services. Republicans don't choose to call that socialism,
No.
right? They just use the word socialism for something else. They pick and choose what freedom looks like. That's why I said it earlier, the free state of Florida is a lie. Look, I don't know what the impact of these last 10 years mean for our culture and our politics permanently. I wrestle with this circular anxiety of, are we at an existential
Sure.
moment,
Mhm.
right? But then I also know that circle comes complete when I realize how resilient we have been as Americans. And frankly, the reason my wife and I are in this race is probably part of that fight for resiliency. I believe we will get through this. I know if we don't try, then it's all lost. And maybe that's what's informing our energy in this race right now.
Well, and I think about it similarly, which is, yes, it took us a long time to get here. It's going to take us a lot of time and work. I think that's the other part. This
Yeah.
is hard. This is not stuff is easy, but we have the opportunity to say, okay, these idiots have burned down the house.
That's right.
What do we want it to look like when we rebuild it? And that's an opportunity, frankly, the opportunity that keeps me going, because if it was just like, well, they burned the house down, good luck, right?
Yeah.
Then it would be too much. All right, I've taken too much of your time. Before I let you go and we go off to the game, where can we find more about you, your family, and your campaign?
Sure, davidjolly.com. I'm sure we're on all the social platforms as well. And I'm sure you can find a lot of archives. Here's what I would tell people who do research on me. I have taken a journey over the last 12 years, right? Hopefully that's appealing. I talk about my change. I test a different question in politics. Is it okay to change your mind? I would suggest to some supporters or possible supporters, if you're concerned about where I was 12 years ago, do look at where my journey has led me today. And if you have hard questions, send us a note through the website, davidjolly.com.
Awesome, David. Thank you. As always, Galen, you
you.
can find me on Threads and Instagram at Reed_Galen USA, and on TikTok, Twitter, says.us, and the rest at Reed Galen. Also, please always go on over to Substack at the Homefront. David Jolly, thanks for joining me.
Good to be with you. Thank you, Reed.
Everybody else, we'll see you next time.